Top of the morning to you, and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Putin attends wreath-laying ceremony in Volgograd to mark Battle of Stalingrad anniversary. Ukraine's army holds tank drills in Kharkiv region amidst fears of new Russian assault. Plus, President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, says his country deserves entry talks at European Union meeting this year. We begin with the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, who's attended a wreath-laying ceremony in the southern Russian city of Volgograd yesterday as part of events to commemorate the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in Stalingrad 80 years ago. He laid flowers at the grave of the Soviet marshal who oversaw the defense of Stalingrad and visited the city's main memorial complex, where he held a minute's silence in honor of those who died during the battle. President Putin was expected to use the anniversary to rally Russians around his military campaign in Ukraine. He was also due to hold a meeting with local patriotic and youth groups in Volgograd, the city that until 1961 was called Stalingrad. In 1942 to 1943, it was the location of the bloodiest battle of the World War, when the Soviet Red Army, at the cost of over 1 million casualties, broke the back of the German invasion forces. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said that Moscow had plans to overshadow pro-Ukrainian events arranged by Western and allied countries around the world to mark the anniversary of Russia sending its armed forces into Ukraine on February the 24th. Lavrov said Russian diplomats were working on something to ensure Western-led events in New York and elsewhere were not the only ones to gain the world's attention. Take a listen.
Our diplomats will do everything to ensure that any mayhem planned for the anniversary of the special military operation at the end of February in New York and elsewhere, the West is now actively planning it along with Kyiv regime, so that these events were not the only ones to grab the international community's attention. We are preparing some evidence. I am absolutely for peace. I am for peace. I don't remember who said this. If you want peace, prepare for war. I don't agree with this philosophy. This is the way I put it. If you want peace, always be ready to defend yourself. And I think that we will emerge stronger from the current geopolitical situation.
Putin has whipped up support for his army's invasion of Ukraine, comparing the fighting with Nazi Germany and issuing threats. He compared Russia's special military operation, as he calls it in Ukraine, to the battle against Nazi Germany in 1941 to 1945, and claimed Russians were ready to go until the end. Putin said, quote, "Again and again, we are forced to repel the aggression of the collective West. We aren't sending tanks to their borders, but we have something to respond with. And it won't be just about using armored vehicles. Everyone should understand this. A modern war with Russia will be completely different." He added that Russia again confronted Germany as he criticized its decision to deliver Leopard 2 tanks to support Ukraine's war efforts. Again, Russia's former president and the deputy chairman of its Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, says Moscow's arms suppliers will significantly increase their deliveries in 2023 to help its forces inflict a crushing defeat on Ukraine. Medvedev said, quote, "Our armed forces regularly receive full supplies of various types of missiles. The delivery of all kinds of military hardware will increase significantly in 2023. Medvedev, who was pictured inspecting missiles during a visit to an arms production factory, said new supplies will enable Russia to inflict a crushing defeat on the Ukrainian neo-Nazis, in his words, who've been fed weapons by a variety of Western scum. Now, Ukrainian armed forces concluded a 3-day military tank drill in northeastern Kharkiv region as country's senior military official warned of possible Russian assault from all fronts. Alexei Danilov, Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, told Ukrainian and international media he does not rule out another attack from the north, the south and the east around the date of February the 24th, the day when Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Military experts say Moscow appears determined to push forward in the coming months before Kyiv received hundreds of newly pledged Western battle tanks and armored vehicles for a counterattack to recapture occupied territory this year. The aim of tank drills was to increase troops' readiness in case of Russian assault in the Kharkiv region. Meanwhile, Ukraine's armed forces conducted military drills in the Chernobyl exclusion zone next to the border with Belarus. Drills involved Soviet-time self-propelled howitzers called ZS-3 Akatsiya and aimed at increasing troops' readiness in case of another Russian assault from the territory of Belarus. Chernobyl nuclear power station was seized by the Russian forces in the first days of the Russian full-fledged invasion, and they withdrew from the territory of the defunct plant by the end of March. Over a dozen top European Union officials visited Kyiv to promise military, financial and political aid and show support for Ukraine before the first anniversary of Russia's invasion. The first such gathering in Kyiv since the war began last February 24th follows the new Western pledges of arms deliveries to help Ukraine resist an expected new Russian offensive. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen promises EU will stand with Ukraine for the long haul.
Europe has been by Ukraine's side since day one, because we know that the future of our continent is being written here. We know that you are fighting for more than yourselves. What is at stake is freedom. This is a fight of democracies against authoritarian regimes. Putin tries to deny the existence of Ukraine, but what he risks instead is the future of Russia. Our presence in Kyiv today gives a very clear signal. The whole of the European Union is in this with Ukraine for the long haul, and we will stand up for Ukraine as we stand up for the fundamental rights and the respect of the international law. And today Russia is paying a heavy price as our sanctions are eroding its economy, throwing it back by a generation. The price cap on crude oil already costs Russia around 160 million euros a day. And we will keep on turning up the pressure further. We will introduce with our G7 partners an additional price cap on Russian petroleum products. And by the 24th of February, exactly 1 year since the invasion started, we aim to have the 10th package of sanctions in place. And Russia must be held accountable in courts for its odious crimes. Prosecutors from Ukraine and the European Union are already working together. We are collecting evidence. And as a first step, I'm pleased to announce that an international center for the prosecution of the crime of aggression in Ukraine will be set up in The Hague.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says his country deserves to start European Union accession talks this year. Zelensky said, quote, "I believe that Ukraine deserves to start negotiations on EU membership this year," adding that further integration with the European bloc will inspire Ukrainians and give them motivation to fight against Russian troops. And again, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says global pressure on Russia had to be increased significantly. The West stepped up pledges to deliver more arms to Ukraine in January, but the EU has made addressing corruption a requirement for Ukraine joining the 27-member bloc, a process that takes years. Now let's talk to Ambassador Joseph Ayalogu, former Nigeria ambassador to Switzerland and the United Nations in Geneva, joining us virtually from London. You're welcome to the program this morning, Ambassador.
Yes, good morning, Lamde. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Now, let's begin with the comments of President Vladimir Putin at Volgograd, where he is drawing comparisons with their defense of themselves from Germany during the Second World War. And what do you make of what he's saying, where in his words he says that, quote, once again, we are facing German Leopard tanks. Obviously, at face value, this is to evoke sympathy with the world concerning how they, when Germany was fighting Russia, they were on the side of the world. The Russians were on the Ally side, and the Germans were on the Axis side. So, do you see what are your initial thoughts, Ambassador, on what he's trying to do?
Well, it's obvious that, well, we all read the same history books as President Putin, and it would be unusual to tell the story, in a roundabout way. In fact, the scenario here now is that the world, or Europe, is struggling against an aggressor, which was actually what happened during the Second World War. So I would say it's perhaps just an attempt to evoke sentiments, but when you want to evoke sentiment using items of history, especially history that everybody knows, it's not far back into time. It's current history, really. It wouldn't wash. It wouldn't make sense, really.
Now, concerning the bringing this war to an end in the first place, and knowing that the Russians are really complaining about the fact that these armored vehicles and these tanks are indeed coming to the Ukrainian side, do you think that this will significantly contribute to helping the Ukrainians defend themselves? Or, as Putin has said, that they have a lot more weapons and they have a lot more ways to respond to the armored vehicles? It'll just escalate the war and make it worse.
Well, sadly, more weapons from either side would mean more war, especially when one of the combatants, which is the aggressor, which is the one that ought to withdraw because it's broken all the international rules, is not ready to do that yet. So, unfortunately, there'll be an escalation. That's what these weapons do for Ukraine, is to at least see whether we can hold back an attempt to decimate a country that is sovereign, that has territorial integrity rights, and so on. So I think these weapons, even though they come in trickling in bit by bit, probably some people would wish that a lot more would have come in a lot earlier, so that probably we'll see a shortened tenure of the war. But for obvious reasons, the weapons seem to be coming in as demanded, and I would say, rather reluctantly, but I don't want to query the European Union and all the NATO and all the allies, why they should not bring in a lot more, much earlier, because it takes quite some time for these weapons to come in and for the training and so on. So the fear is that they may not even serve the ultimate purpose, but one will pay credit to the tenacity of the Ukrainians. I think they are doing their best, given the circumstances. So, like I'm trying to say, the weapons will help to keep Ukraine still alive, let me use the term alive, and still as a sovereign country, because that's exactly what Putin wants to put an end to.
Ambassador, a bone of contention for President Vladimir Putin at the onset of the war was that Ukraine was going to join NATO, and that didn't sit well with the Russians. And now that the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, is talking about the European Union membership, do you think it's more provocative, or Russia doesn't have anything to say about this, and this is also a good time for Ukraine to continue to make their positions known on the international stage?
Well, if things were left as they were, Ukraine entry into even the EU, which is easier, would probably have taken decades, probably 2 decades, because entry requires a lot. You have to meet a lot of conditionalities, which they would be struggling to meet. So it wouldn't. It wasn't an immediate thing that will happen. But of course, the action of Putin's action to attack Ukraine, a sovereign country, has created a specter of a new in Europe that Europe would want to forget. That is the specter of an individual driving a country or his country to try to annex another country. That was what they suffered during the Second World War, and probably earlier wars, and definitely earlier wars. So it was hoped that this century would have seen an end to that sort of scenario. Unfortunately, that is not the case. So it's now pushing Ukraine really more into the hands of well, let me say democratic Europe, because it's really a matter of democracy versus autocracy and all that.
Ambassador, with your diplomatic history in Europe, can you give us an insight into the European psyche, especially of the Ukrainians? Because now the world knows their fighting spirit. And by the 24th of February, it'll be 21 days from now to a year of this war, which obviously, as it is being touted, Russia didn't see it coming, but it's unprecedented for the Ukrainians. What can you tell us of how the Ukrainians, how resilient they will be should this war continue indefinitely after the first, or for a much longer period, God forbid, after the first year?
Well, I have quite some knowledge of European history, past and more recent, and I had also the opportunity to spend 3.5 years in Ukraine as deputy head of mission there, and interacted a lot. You know that there was this collection of Soviets that we know as the USSR. There was a willing engagement of various republics that were, that had Soviet backgrounds. And on their own, they decided to separate, which indicated that everybody, each of them would want to go wherever they wanted to push. I thought one would have thought that was the outcome, normal outcome expectations of the breakup of the Soviet Union. Naturally, some of the countries that made up the Soviet Union would have, are beginning to see an interest in the way the West runs itself, democracy, free market, and all sorts of things, human rights, and so on. And the continuation of the Russian regime system in Russia itself hasn't actually helped the Ukrainians or anybody else, especially those in the periphery, to begin to see why they would need to stay with Russia, even if it's for the point of an orbital relationship. So gradually you find the people, the government, leaning towards Western tendencies, Western values. I witnessed that because I was in Ukraine for 3.5 years. So I could see the difference from the time I came and up to the time I was leaving. There was a lot more interest in running things the way it is run in the EU than the way Russia runs things in the Russian enclave. So that is the dichotomy. And frankly, you will not deny that Ukraine has a right, or the Ukrainians have a right to choose their fortunes, their future. Back to the issue of what could happen. Well, we obviously can see that Putin is not taking a lesson from the history that he tends to refer to from time to time. That in European history or world history, whenever well, let me say a dictator, somebody comes up and wants to gobble up the rest of Europe, either because he wants to acquire land or for whatever reason, or just because of its own personal psychology, that it raises opposition. And gradually you find that opposition clustering into a force that will stop that person. It's always been the case. And I can see that also happening, despite all the terrible equipment that Russia would have, or rather strong, their capacity to do damage, which is unfortunate though. We shouldn't be thinking of, we should be thinking of global development rather than breaking up things. But that is it. I see at the end of the day, Ukrainians are committed to put an end to the Russian aggression, at least against her. They are all made of the same sinews, so they know that how their strength runs. And we would hopefully see, hopefully see that Ukraine is able to maintain its position as a sovereign country, and it would also send a message globally that never again should an individual decide to trample over other countries, other nations' sovereign rights.
Ambassador, therefore, a Western-leaning Ukraine, as you've just pointed out, what about what Putin is alluding to as well, that there are people in Ukraine who do not want to be a part of Ukraine and have loyalties to Russia? Is that significant enough of a number in your experience there to influence policy in Ukraine in any way, and possibly even regime change because of being tired of the war?
Well, demographically, I don't think there are a lot more Russians than Ukrainians in Ukraine. But it doesn't really matter too much. Once anybody in the enclave of, in the territory of a sovereign entity becomes part of that country and has to be part of its development. It happens everywhere. There are Nigerians in Benin. There are Nigerians in Cameroon. We don't go we don't go to try to undermine the integrity of those countries because we say we want to protect Nigerians there. That's not right. It's not the way the world runs these days. So Putin should have played this game nicer. Probably he's been undermining the integrity, the sovereignty surreptitiously by supporting dissident Russians. If he stuck to that, taking his fortunes however they come, there probably wouldn't have been a war, but he took it too far out of way. That's part of the problem now. He's been supporting pro-Russian groups in Ukraine. Well, the Ukraine system has been managing it as they ought to be able to do, because it's all a responsibility of the government of a country to manage the emergent issues within that country. So that is it. We just have an unfortunate situation where somebody does not care about respecting established rights, especially established rules and norms of international relations. That is what it is.
Finally, Ambassador, we know that Putin is a patriot, a Russian patriot, considers himself so, and drawing comparisons to Stalingrad, now Volgograd, in the Second World War, and the Germans attacking then, and the heroic feats of the Russians that was a decisive part of ending Germany's campaign, to what's happening now is wanting to obviously evoke nationalist sympathy and sentiments around Russia to rally the troops, as it were, and even the citizens. If you had 30 minutes with a sit-down on President Putin one-on-one, what would you tell him?
I would tell him, first of all, to read that history again. If he's referring to the Second World War, there was a man called Hitler who happened to be a German, who decided that for his personal aggrandizement, or what he perceived as, well, what is good for Germany from his own eye, that he will run through all the countries in Europe, started with the weaker ones, and so on. That led to the conflagration that we call the Second World War. Of course, it was in that process that it also attacked Russia. And I'll tell him I will ask him, is that the same situation now? The situation is reversed. And there's one person in Europe that feels that an imperial Russia is what should what he prefers. That sovereignty of smaller states don't matter. He has to, press the rights of the supremacy of Russia over smaller countries around. That's why the war is. I would urge him to think twice, think again, withdraw from this path of aggression, and the war will be at peace again and develop as much as in a friendly manner. But he wouldn't listen to me. He wouldn't listen to me.
He wouldn't listen to you. Yes, I think we can take that for granted at this point. Yeah. Thank you so much. But we hope that people that he will listen to do bring some sort of influence to bear, so that this does not go beyond a year and to God knows when. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your time. We've been speaking with Ambassador Joseph Ayologo, former Deputy Head of Missions in Ukraine and former Ambassador to Switzerland. Thank you so much for making the time to speak with us this morning on Russian invasion.
Thank you, Ramade.
Welcome back to our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Austria is expelling 4 Russian diplomats for behaving in a manner inconsistent with international agreements, a reason often invoked in a spy case. That's according to the Austrian Foreign Ministry, without giving specifics. The move brings to 9 the number of Russian diplomats Austria has expelled since 2020, although no connection between the 3 separate decisions is clear. Austria has generally been more reluctant than many other Western European countries to expel Russian envoys. The ministry in a statement said that 2 of the 4 diplomats declared persona non grata on Thursday and ordered to leave the country by February 8th are stationed at the Russian embassy at Austria, while the other 2 work at the Russian mission to the United Nations in Vienna. The ministry stated that the 2 diplomats of the Russian embassy had acted in a manner inconsistent with their diplomatic status, while the 2 working at the Russian mission to the UN acted in a way that was also inconsistent with the host country agreement between the United Nations and Austria. Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani says an Italo-French SAMP air defense system will be running in Ukraine within the next 2 months. The system can track several targets and intercept 10 at once. It's the only European-made system that can intercept ballistic missiles. Kyiv has repeatedly asked its Western allies for more air defense systems and specifically requested the SAMP known as Mamba in November. Meanwhile, trucks carrying 20 M113 armored personnel carriers has arrived at Bilbao port in northern Spain before departing for Ukraine. Spanish Defense Minister Margarita Robles announced on Wednesday the armored vehicles will leave for Ukraine on Monday, February the 6th. According to Spanish media, the armored personnel carriers will first go to a NATO base in Latvia. Spain also plans to send between 4 and 6 German-built Leopard 2A4 tanks to Ukraine. The Interfax news agency quoted Finance Minister Sergei Marchenko as saying Ukraine hopes to start talks with the International Monetary Fund, IMF, on a financing program in a few months. The IMF approved a 4-month monitoring program for Ukraine in December to maintain its economic stability after Russia's invasion and help promote donor financing. Marchenko says, "We hope that the successful implementation of the monitoring program with the IMF will allow us to receive a full-fledged financing program from the IMF, and we will negotiate this beginning the second quarter of this year already." The government estimated it needs $38 billion to cover its budget deficit this year and $17 billion to make urgent repairs to energy and other infrastructure. A campaign group describes Shell's record profits as shameless, saying the energy giant is profiting at the expense of the planet. Shell declared a record $40 billion profit in 2022, capping a tumultuous year in which a surge in energy prices after Russia's invasion of Ukraine allowed it to hand shareholders unprecedented returns. The British company's record earnings, which more than doubled from a year earlier, mirrored those reported by U.S. rivals earlier this week and are certain to intensify pressure on government to further raise taxes in the sector.
It's obscene, but it's also shameless because they're reaping those record profits at the expense of people and the planet. Yesterday, hundreds of thousands of people went out in the streets to protest and strike against their low pay and the rising cost of living. Me and many of my colleagues also went on the streets to support them, while oil giants like Shell are lining the pockets of their shareholders from these profits that they made. And at the same time, there is a refusal from the government to impose a windfall tax on them, and also to help alleviate those suffering from families that are already choosing between heating and eating. This profit is already being made on the backs of people that are getting the sharp or at the sharp edge of the climate impacts of their operations all over the world or globally. And also, we all know that oil companies' fossil fuel emissions are a main cause of climate change.
And for the business angle to the war in Ukraine by the Russian invasion is Laddie Williams, our business correspondent. Good morning, Laddie.
Thank God it's Friday.
Thank God it's Friday. How are Europe doing this thing of ramping up their oil war against Russia, as you mentioned?
Yeah, so the war, continues on, trying to disrupt Russia's funding, of this war, their war chest. They're trying to disrupt, how much they're getting, because they gained, a lot, when oil prices, went up last year, hit that all-time high, about $140, per barrel. And, you did hear Shell there declaring, mega profit, from all of that. And we've had all the windfall tax, conversations. And now that's ramping up even more, because seeing what they gained in 2022. And oil prices, still remain high at this time. So it's possible that 2023 is also going to be, a great year for, these companies and, countries like Russia, that gain from oil. But, we're seeing some analysts say that, we might still hit $100 per barrel in 2023. But all of that, depends on, the China reopening and all of that. So we're seeing Europe now. First, it was the price cap on Russian oil. That was December 5th last year. That's, come into play already. But others were, wondering that, okay, Russia is still selling their oil at lower than that. So there were complaints about that price cap. They wanted it lower, but obviously 60, was the consensus. So now they're taking it further now. Come February 5th, they're now going to put a cap on petroleum products, being exported from Russia, like diesel, fuel oils and all of that.
So Russia can only make so much money.
Exactly, from other exports of oil. So that is another blow to, Russia's revenue, from oil, from the oil market. And if that comes into play, February 5th, you see the diesel price cap will be about $100, for Russian diesel. And if anybody tries to buy higher than that, then the logistic companies will not honor that transaction. Insurance companies will not honor it. So it's more pressure, coming for, Russian revenue from oil at this point in 2023. But some analysts are still saying that this cap would also disrupt, the energy market even further, which can cause, obviously, we know what disruption does. Prices will, end up going up again, and that will now play into the inflation story. And we've seen how energy prices raise inflation in 2022. We don't want to see that, in 2023. But it looks like that might be where we're heading, with this February 5th deadline coming up.
What could Russia do? Now, you also mentioned that Russia may switch to taxing oil producers based on Brent crude prices rather than the currently used benchmark.
Yeah, because they're using Urals, at this time. And we know the price of Urals are cheaper, way cheaper than, what we get with Brent and the Russian crude benchmark. So at this point, the tax for the Urals obviously have been going down also while the prices are going down. So that's impacting how much revenue the government is getting. So we're seeing, Putin is looking for ways to, restructure that tax framework, see how they can benchmark it to Brent instead of Urals, so that they can still, make the relevant taxes that they're supposed to be getting, from Ural exports. But at the same time, we know that other countries are going to obviously want to do something to counter that, because this will also disrupt what the players in the market, because they're going to have to pay more tax, if it's benchmarked to Brent, because Brent is more expensive than Urals.
Is this a workable decision?
It's something that they're still working on at this time. But we know Putin, when he puts his mind to something, it will end up happening some way, somehow. But at the end of the day, they still have to discuss it, see how workable it's going to be, because at the end of the day, these market participants don't want to pay that much tax, for the Urals.
Thank you so much, Ladi. Ladi will be back with us, with you, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine with Business Morning.
Exactly. Thank you.
Welcome back. The Baltic nations and Poland have called on international sports bodies to ban Russian and Belarusian athletes from competing in the Olympics and other events while the war in Ukraine continues. Sports ministers from Latvia and Estonia said they were in dialogue with sympathetic Nordic countries to build a coalition of support for the proposal.
that we condemn this statement what the International Olympic Committee made about the athletes of the aggression countries. And we say very straight out that for us, we don't agree that the sport people from Russia and Belarus will take part of the Olympic Games. If we talk about at all boycott, then this is the last solution. And I think right now it's not time to speculate too much about that. We said very clear that even we had the connections in the culture and in the sport field, that after this war, we also stop those cooperation before the war is ended, and we don't continue before the war is ended. We can't say right now that the Olympic or sport is something where we can say this is not connected or this we avoid this question there. I think right now everything is for us connected with the war, and if we can show the place to the Russia and Belarus, then we have to do that.
Together with ministers from Estonia, Latvia, and Poland, we have agreed that on our joint statement against the inclusion of Russian and Belarusian sportsmen into international sport events. And we will continue working also discussing with our Nordic colleagues in order to expand our coalition and to condemn the efforts of International Olympic Committee for their efforts to bring Russian and Belarusian sportsmen into international competition. I think that that's very clear that they are aggressors. The war is going on in Ukraine, and Ukrainian sportsmen, men and women, they are dying currently. And at the same time, we are discussing that men from aggressor countries, Russia and Belarus, can participate in the competition. And I don't know if you would imagine that we can compete with Ukrainian sportsmen.
However, a Polish minister says Poland believes it will be able to build a coalition of some 40 countries, including the US, Britain, and Canada, by February 10, supporting the call to block Russian and Belarusian athletes from the 2024 Alliance, 2024 Olympics, beg your pardon. The Baltic nations and Poland earlier called on international sports bodies to ban Russian and Belarusian athletes from competing in the Olympics and other events while the war in Ukraine continues. The International Olympic Committee announced last week that athletes from the two countries banned from competing in Europe might be allowed to earn slots for the Paris 2024 Games through Asian qualifying, although the IOC later said it was standing by sanctions imposed against Russia and Belarus. However, the United States, the White House there, says the United States supports allowing athletes from Russia and Belarus to compete as neutrals in the Olympic Games while opposing the display of their national flags or emblems. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre says if athletes are invited to international events such as the Olympics, it shall be absolutely clear that they are not representing the Russian or Belarusian states. The war has spilled into the sporting arena with a growing chorus of calls to have athletes from Russia and its allies, Belarus, blocked from the 2024 Olympics in Paris. From Mission Impossible to Miracle on Ice. That's how Yevgeny Sarenko, the coach of the Ukrainian Pee Wee hockey team, described the team's unlikely arrival in Quebec. The group of 11 and 12-year-olds were all smiles after they touched down in Montreal, in Canada, and they were given a tour of the Videotron Center in Quebec, where the Quebec International Pee Wee hockey tournament will be played.
Yeah, it was very difficult last week, especially with preparations and all organization stuff, but now I'm relaxing a little bit, and kids are exciting, very exciting. How? Yeah, this is almost a miracle, miracle on the ice. It will be in soon. Before it was Mission Impossible, and now it's Miracle on the Ice. Yeah, I heard a lot about the schedule for us, and it will be pretty full schedule for kids, a lot of impressions, a lot of emotions. But I hope we make a good impression, good results also. They are already a little bit, I would say, forgot what happened in Ukraine, but at the same time, they remember this every day because they need to speak with the parents, and some fathers are fighting now, a real war, and they know this. And you cannot forget this, but sometimes they're smiling and happy.
That's our program for today. On a programming note, this is the final episode of Russian Invasion Daily in the morning until after the 2023 Nigeria's general elections from Monday, February 6th, 2023. We will be giving you the same robust coverage to that conflict in our daily program, The World Today, which is at 5 p.m. daily, Monday to Friday. So do join us for that. On behalf of the production team, thanks for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Goodbye. God bless you.